Mr. Harper, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's a pleasure to speak to you.
Could you give me an overview of the status of the humanitarian crisis in Syria, both in the region as well as here in Jordan?
Well, the numbers are quite staggering, and it's probably the biggest displaced population that we've seen in the Middle East in modern times. It surpasses the Palestinian displacement in '67, also in '48. It dwarfs what happened in Iraq, and I think that's probably one of the scary things that we've got. Anyone who has had anything to do with the Iraq conflict and is aware of the extreme displacement, the extreme problems that occurred in Iraq, and Syria is, in my view, much worse than what's happened in Iraq, which again cannot be underestimated. But we're not actually seeing any resolution in sight to what's going on in Syria. We've got 4 million people, 4.5 million people who have been displaced. We've got 2 million refugees at least, and those numbers are increasing by the day. And the overall humanitarian situation inside Syria is deteriorating. There's less work available for people to be able to look after their families, less children going to school, less electricity being supplied. The amount of water which is being provided is becoming less and less clean. Medical facilities are having trouble keeping open, and what that is leading to is people being pushed to leave the country. Like, no one wants to leave their country, no one wants to become a refugee, but what we're seeing is that tens of thousands of Syrians are leaving every week towards the surrounding countries. Jordan has over 600,000 Syrians now, and we just do not know how that is going to pan out in the future, because Jordan is a relatively small country with extremely limited resources. It's done a fantastic job so far in keeping its borders open and paying due respect to the needs of the refugees. But what people often don't take into account is it's not just the Syrians that Jordan is looking after. You've also got a significant Iraqi population that's still here, and a couple of million Palestinians. And so if you look at the total population of Jordan, which is 6 or 7 million people, and you've got probably half of those who have got either direct refugees or descendants of refugees. And so for a country which has basically got no water, no oil, despite being in the Middle East, it's pretty tough maintaining this very almost heroic stance on refugee protection.
You've described just now a very daunting list of the challenges.
And this afternoon in New York City, the Security Council at the UN is going to be having its, I believe, 6th briefing on the humanitarian crisis this year. Could you describe maybe what you think that the challenges are, even for professionals, people who are used to dealing with refugee issues, humanitarian crises, in fully understanding the scope of the Syrian crisis?
Well, you mentioned the briefings in New York. Like, that's they're always useful to try and raise the awareness. But what we are seeing is like, we're on the front line. Like, we've just came back from the border yesterday, where we spent 2 days with the Jordanian border guards, moving up and down from east to west, going basically from close to the Israel all the way across to Iraq. And one of our challenges is just to ensure that refugees can get across, that in the upcoming winter we have the roads and bridges available and up to standard that can actually transport them out, because people are crossing in some of the most remote locations which you can imagine. Very harsh desert conditions, but it's not always necessarily dry, and so what we'd expect is that there'd be flooding during winter, and that the desert conditions that we see at the moment will probably turn into impassable waterlogged terrain, which will be very difficult to get the trucks through. So that's one element. The other issue is to provide proper support and assistance to the hundreds of thousands of Syrians who are not in refugee camps, but who are hidden within the urban communities. Women who have lost their husbands, children who have lost their fathers, and who really do not have the means to continue on with their what we'd consider as normal lives. They can't go to school because they don't have money, and women often are put into exploitive positions because they need to keep their families together. They need to provide them with the most basic support. So we're trying to get as much support out in the form of cash assistance, food assistance through WFP. UNICEF's trying to get kids into school, but the numbers are daunting. Like, we've got 600,000 Syrians, and we've got hundreds of thousands more who would like to come across if they could.
You just described the difference between those Syrians who have made it to camps within Jordan, and then what you described, and we've heard your colleagues describe as invisible refugees who have found their way to cities. Let's start, though, with the camps. We've been to Zaatari twice, and to the newly constructed and ongoing project at Al-Azraq. Particularly on Zaatari, one thing that struck me visiting there was just the impression that I was in a city almost. It felt as if things were approaching a state of permanence at Zaatari. And I wonder, in your view, are there any pitfalls in that, approaching a sense of permanency at camps like Zaatari?
Well, it's the last thing that Jordanians would want to hear is that word permanence, because they have got a Palestinian population which believed that they would be returning within a week or two, and they're still here, and several generations later. We all hope and pray that the Syrians can go home as soon as they possibly can. However, it's our job to ensure that we are ready for the unexpected, that we are prepared for the worst case scenario. It's also a situation of management of a refugee camp. You have to move away from an emergency style response to ensuring that you have a sustainable response. And so we do look at replacing temporary classrooms or temporary structures with something which is a little bit more durable. Also, the conditions out there do not allow for a tent to be a mean of accommodation, because it is just such tough conditions. Like, you have winds going up over 100 kilometres an hour, you're getting 40 plus degrees of heat, and then like last year we had the highest rain and snowfall for 20 years. And so how do you plan for that? So thankfully, like, our response was, I think, better than good. I think we did a very good job. So no one died of exposure, no one drowned, which in a flash flood type situation in the desert, this can often happen. And so the mortality rate in the camp is lower than the rest of Jordan. The morbidity rate in the camp is lower than the rest of Jordan. There's probably more water going into the camp per capita than other parts of Jordan, same with the food. So we're doing whatever we can, but now we do have to try and put in place a means to make the camp more sustainable, almost more self-sufficient. And it's also important for the refugees to see that the communities have been re-established, because you do not want them just to be sitting there by themselves waiting upon everyone. And if you walk down the main street, the main commercial centre, you see the Syrians taking control of their lives. They've opened up shops, which gives them a sense of pride. They're getting their dignity back. The kids are going to school. They're generating money amongst themselves. So this is all things which we're very proud of. Like, we're spending a lot of money on electricity to make sure the camp is electrified, which the shop owners are using to make their businesses. I would actually say it's probably the best economic zone in Jordan at the moment, because you have such a vibrant population there. And when you have 100,000 people, if it doesn't look like a city already, then you're doing something wrong.
I want to shift to the urban element of this, just to give it due time, because of just the numbers reflecting that. Everyone we've spoken to, particularly in the NGO community, says that is the story that is difficult to tell. Some have said maybe Zaatari gets so much coverage because compared to some of the largest camps in the world, it's so conveniently located. It's easy to visit. Turning to the urban crisis, what challenges do you have in dealing with the numbers there? What are the top challenges for you?
Well, it starts from the border. We get people coming in and we register them. UNHCR has now registered 550,000 people. That means that our staff here, who have been working 24/7, collecting documents, listening to the very tragic stories of refugees, getting whatever information they can to base the claims of the refugees, that's a lot of work just to begin with. Like, listening to 540,000 different stories, having that documented, having it put into computer systems. Then we have to go out and identify who are the most vulnerable. and that's often not necessarily that easy. In a refugee camp, it's contained, you can move around, you can find where people are. There's no real places to hide. We know where the most vulnerable people are. In cities, we've got largely no idea. So what we do have is we have volunteers that go house to house in areas where there's refugees located, and we ask the neighbours, are there women who may be at risk, are there children going to school? And following that, we've actually undertaken something like 63,000 house visits, which is quite in itself an achievement. Anything which involves less than tens of thousands is not less than what they require, because one of the elements which has worked against the Syrians is that they have arrived in such large numbers that it's increased the prices of rental, it's increased the prices of basic commodities, and so it's more and more difficult for many Syrians to survive in the large cities, so they've actually had to move further afield.
Well, just 2 days ago we spent an evening with a Syrian family who had relocated. They were originally in Zaatari and then had come to the university district here in Amman. They had originally registered, I believe, with UNHCR, and then had decided to leave the camp, and in the city expressed a sense of confusion at being able to know exactly where to go for all certain services, particularly vouchers. I mean, beyond the site visits, what other challenges, what other challenges essentially do you have in making sure urban refugees are aware of the full suite of options that the UN makes available?
Well, that's you hit the nail on the head. Like making sure that refugees are aware of what they're entitled to and what protection mechanisms that they have available for them. We found that what's the best thing is either through word of mouth within the refugee community or through SMS. And so we often send out messages to the refugee community just by SMS to sort of say, okay, this is the hotline for UNHCR. This is the contact name numbers for the family protection department within the Jordanian government. We get messages a lot out within the media, but what we do find also is one of the challenges is that it's actually quite a conservative population, and that you can have families who come across as a unified group, but then the husband may go back to Syria, leaving the wife and the kids here. And the wife and the kids may not necessarily feel comfortable about going out in public. And so they basically lock down. They stay in the basements of these apartments. They'll stay waiting for people to come and help them. So it is very difficult to sometimes penetrate into these almost fairly conservative refugee groups. But we're doing it. We're doing it very, I think, quite well with our NGO colleagues and partners, but also very much with the Jordanian government, who have allowed Syrian refugees access to health services, allowed Syrian children to go to school. So these basic elements are very much appreciated.
You mentioned cooperation with the Jordanian government. The numbers of refugees entering into the country from Syria has fluctuated more times than we can count over the past 2.5 years. Though in recent weeks it seems to have steadied out. From what you're aware of, are all the borders between Syria and Jordan open at the moment? And what could be behind sort of a low and steady number entering the country at this time?
Well, I was up at the border, as I was saying, a couple of days ago, and we had something like 1,500 people cross. So it's obviously open in that area. On the eastern side, refugees are still coming across, and they're extremely in pretty bad shape. They come from Homs and Hummer and Aleppo and rough Damascus. On the western side, we're not necessarily seeing the numbers that were coming across before. And that's, the western side was when we were having 3,000, 4,000 people coming a night. And one of the reasons that we believe the numbers have decreased there is because of the change in the numbers of groups who are in control. And we're thinking that there's restrictions being placed by such groups as the Al-Nusra Front or by different brigades restricting people coming down. I think it's also quite difficult for people to move within Syria because of the security situation. So you have a situation where some groups, some opposition groups may not necessarily want to have 10, 20,000, 30,000 more people that they have to look after. And so incrementally it becomes difficult. It's difficult often to move within Syria, even through government-controlled areas. But then if you actually have to move down through opposition-controlled areas, they will also put up restrictions too. So I don't think anyone is completely supportive of having the freedom of movement of displaced populations inside Syria. Right. That's why I think people are having to take this more desperate and torturous route through the eastern desert, because you don't have as many checkpoints out that way.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about something I heard during the General Assembly just a few weeks ago in New York. It was when the Syrian Foreign Minister was speaking. He made a claim essentially that Syrian refugees in Jordan were in military-style barracks and that they were suffering inhumane conditions, and he called on them to return to Syria, saying the government could guarantee them food and shelter and a promise of no discrimination against whether they had left the country or not. We have heard about people returning to the country. We've seen it at Zaatari. Is now a good time for people to be returning to Syria?
I'd leave that up to the Syrians to decide themselves. I think anyone who looks at the situation inside Syria is very worried about what people are facing when they return back there. Lack of healthcare, lack of access to education. We all hope that at some point Syrians will be able to return. We all hope that the Syrian government will be looking to enhance the services, particularly in those areas which are extremely vulnerable and where there's a major problem in humanitarian access. But UNHCR is not encouraging people to return home. We're not facilitating people to return. We're monitoring people as they return, just to understand why they're going back, where they're going back, trying to make sure that they're aware of the situation. But when it comes down to it, refugees have a much better understanding and are much more informed than anyone about what's the situation in their homeland, in their towns, and their communities. And they will make their choices based on elements which are not necessarily cut and dried and obvious to us. It could be that their parts of their family may have remained there. They may have to go back to sell some property. There may have been someone who died in Syria and they're returning back for the funeral. There's a whole host of reasons. Everyone has got their own reason why they became a refugee. People have got their own individual reasons why they may go back.
Is there anything else you would share with the UN if you were to be giving the briefing at the Security Council today, or anything else you would tell the American people about what they should know or what they should do to be of assistance?
Well, I would certainly be passing my extreme and sincere thanks to the American people for the support they've given to UNHCR in particular. We wouldn't have been able to do what we have done if it wasn't for the support of the US government and the US people, because the US is our largest supporter. And I would not necessarily say that nothing has worked in regards to the Syrian response, because I think on the humanitarian side, on the refugee response side, we've almost performed miracles, because you've had over 2 million people come across the respective borders. As I showed you before, we're working in some pretty tough environment. There's been the mortality rates are lower than the rest of Jordan. All sphere standards have been met, such as access to education and healthcare. The relationship with the government has been excellent. So I think we've kicked a number of goals in that regards. The challenge that we will have is, what do we do in 2014, 2015? What happens when Syria starts moving off the front page or the second page or the third page, which will happen. Sure. And then you'll have a country like Jordan who will still have 600,000 to 1 million Syrian refugees, but the donor interest will diminish. So what we'd be looking for is obviously a focus on getting a peaceful solution in Syria so people can return back, but continued support to Jordan until such time that they can go back, because Jordan is a shining example of what countries should be doing. They should keep their borders open, they should be willing to accept refugees, but they should not be expected to do that at no cost. This is not the refugee problem is not just Jordan's problem, it's not just a regional problem, it is really an international problem. Every country in the world has got a viewpoint on what should happen in Syria.
And we have seen Syrian refugees as far as Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and so like people sort of ignore Jordan at their own risk, because if Jordan does not receive the resources, then the refugees will look to move elsewhere.
Mr. Harper, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you very much for coming.